That might express how many of us are this morning. However, understand that Jesus teaches us that whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. I want you to remember the context that this second parable on prayer comes to us within. The context is the delay in Christ's coming. And if we remember the parable last week of the persistent widow and the unjust judge, and Jesus encourages us to continue to persevere, to follow him in faith, even though we don't know when he is coming. So the first prayer, the first parable of the unjust judge really describes the kind of people who pray. But then this parable describes for us the kind of people that God vindicates. Who is the one that God vindicates? It is not the one that lifts himself up. It is the one who brings himself low. And in this parable, Jesus reveals for us the kind of attitude that God commends. And the kind of attitude that God commends is an attitude of humility and not pride. So I want to give you the big idea this morning. We'll get right into the text. The big idea is simply this: in order to be accepted by God, I must kill the Pharisee in me. In order to be accepted by God, I must kill the Pharisee in me. So I want to share with you from the parable this morning 3 principles. It's interesting that this word trusted in themselves is the same word that Jesus uses in the gospel, in the same gospel in chapter 11, where it talks about Jesus entering into the strong man's house and taking away his armor. But the strong man who holds the palace, who is fortified in the palace, trusts in his armor. That word trust is the same one. So Jesus comes and takes away his trust. And here we see at the outset of this parable that Jesus is coming to take away something from those who trusted in themselves. And what is it that Jesus is getting ready to take away? He's getting ready to take away this idea of religion, this idea of a works-based righteousness. And then Jesus begins the parable by contrasting the Pharisee and the tax collector. Now keep in mind that the Pharisee was the common man's hero in Jesus' day. He was the religious one. He was the one who they were the most pious of all the Israelites. They were the ones who were looked up to. When a father was raising his son, if his son had any smarts, he would put him into one of the schools of the rabbis so that ultimately he could become a Pharisee, because the Pharisees were the most respected among the religious teachers of Israel. And then you have, conversely, the tax collector, who was the most despised personality in all of Israel. We've talked about how tax collectors made their money before. I don't want to go into that today. Essentially, tax collectors robbed their own kin in order to make their own salaries. And so tax collectors were despised by the Jewish populace. In fact, they were considered such scoundrels that their testimony was not, they were not allowed to testify in court. Neither were they able to hold any kind of public office. And it's interesting that Jesus begins this parable by telling us in verse 10 that 2 men, the Pharisee and the tax collector, went up into the temple to pray. Now keep in mind that the temple in Jerusalem sat upon Mount Moriah, which is about 2,520 feet above sea level, surrounded by 4 different valleys. And so when the worshipers went up to the temple, they actually had to go up into the temple to pray. It's fascinating. On our last trip to Israel, we were able to be at the southern steps there, where all of the common people, the people of Israel, would march up those steps. And as the sun began to gleam off of those huge limestone walls, and the brilliant radiance of the reflection would shine in their eyes, and as they were climbing up the mountain or the steps to this beautiful temple, it must have felt like they were entering into the presence of God himself. So it is that they went up to the temple to pray. Now, the Pharisees had two times of prayer. The Jews had two times of prayer every day, 9 a.m. in the morning, 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And at each of these times of prayer, a sacrifice would take place. The altar of sacrifice, and then as the stench of the flesh or stench of the carcass is rising up, the priest would light the altar of incense, and the sweet-smelling incense would cover. By himself prayed, God, I thank you. Now notice his posture, because Jesus tells us that the Pharisee was standing by himself. Now, the inference here is that the Pharisee was standing in a place that was apart from the community of Israel. Keep in mind that these particular worship services took place in the court of Israel. The court of Israel was adjacent to the most holy place, and inside the inner sanctum of the holy place was the most holy place, or as we might call it, the Holy of Holies. And so the inference here is that this particular Pharisee was standing as close as he could. He was on the boundary between the most holy place, where he could not go, and the court of Israel. And he was there because he wanted to be seen. And Jesus even reminds us of Pharisees who love their greetings in the marketplaces, and they love to pray out loud, and it was the custom of Jews to pray out loud. And so with his phylacteries, those boxes that were on his wrist and on his head that held Scripture, he would hold his hands up high and pray and thank God that he was not like everybody else. Now, notice that when the Pharisee starts, he seems to start his prayer well. I thank God. How many know it's a good idea to thank God? But notice that his prayer quickly goes off the tracks, doesn't it? Because he begins to thank God not for God's mercy, but because he's not like the other vermin that surround him. I thank you that I am not like other men, like extortioners, the unjust, adulterers. And notice the contempt that he has for this tax collector, or even like this tax collector. Then notice his accomplishments that he trumpets. I fast twice a week. Keep in mind that for the Jews, they were commanded to fast one time a year. Every adult Jewish male commanded to fast one time a year. That was the Day of Atonement. But the Pharisees went above and beyond the call of duty. They fasted not just once a year, they fasted twice a week on Monday and Thursday. Monday and Thursday because it was the thought that that's the days that Moses had gone up to receive the commandments on Sinai, and on Thursday he came down. In fact, it's interesting that an early Christian writer, actually, the Christians fasted on Tuesday and Friday so that they would not fast on Monday and Thursday like the hypocrites who were the Pharisees. And so he says, I fast twice a week. I go above and beyond, and I give a tithe of everything that comes into my possession. Now again, the Pharisees tithed on what their fields produced. They were commanded to tithe on what their fields produced. However, the Pharisee went above and beyond what his fields produced and actually tithed from his herb garden, which he wasn't commanded to tithe from. So here we have a picture, don't we, that is setting us in focus of who this Pharisee is. He is one who is going above and beyond the pale of religious exercise. He is one who is giving himself wholeheartedly to religion. He is one who is doing all of the works. He is putting forth all of the effort, and he is thankful that he is able to do it. He is encouraging himself. I thank God that I'm not like other people. I thank God that I'm not like these poor sinners. I thank God that I'm on a different plane. I thank God that I do more than they do. I thank God that I serve more than they do. I thank God that I give more than they do. Surely now, God, you must be pleased with me. And I want to take a couple of moments here and just let's apply what the Pharisee has said. First of all, notice that the Pharisee's prayer was not directed to God, but to himself. Do you see that? I thank God that was the only time God is mentioned in the entire prayer. The rest of the time, the Pharisee just simply enters into self-congratulatory mode. Notice 5 times he refers to I, and always in the active voice. I'm reminded that whenever your prayer begins with I or I will, you need to start over. Some of us, that's all of our prayer life. I want, I need, I demand. I'm reminded that pride always begins with I. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 14, where it talks about Lucifer who fell, before Lucifer fell, there were 5 I wills that he uttered. He said, I will ascend into heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of the assembly. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So every time we engage in this form of pride, we are being just like the devil. Notice that the Pharisee didn't ask God for anything because he didn't think that he needed anything. I'm good. I've got it all worked out. I'm doing the best I can on my own, and that's good enough. God, I'm glad that you're here to pat me on the back. I'm glad that you're here to tell me how great I am, but at the moment, I really don't need your help. I'm doing fine. Many of us, maybe not in the same way, but the same attitude presupposes what's happening in the Pharisee's heart, in our own prayer lives. I don't need God. I'm doing just fine on my own. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, or maybe you're testing out the Christian worldview or the Christian faith, and you're trying to make a decision about whether you're going to follow Jesus or not, and you seem to be thinking, well, you know, I'm doing fine enough on my own. I really don't need God for anything. I've got a wonderful spouse. I've got a great job. I've got good kids. You know, all of the things that I've wanted in life have come to me. I really don't need God. I'm really good. I'm reminded of the tale of the barnyard tragedy. How many's ever heard of the tale of the barnyard tragedy? It is a tale of the rooster. He began to crow. And when he crowed, the family awoke, and all the animals on the farm awoke. And every day, every time the rooster crowed, the family awoke, and all the animals awoke. And then his thinking began to get twisted. And he began to think that the sun rose because he crowed, rather than him crowing because the sun rose. And then he became an insomniac because he thought, if I don't stay up and crow, then the family won't get up and the animals won't get up. Then he was taken off to a home for disturbed roosters. And that is the tale of the barnyard tragedy. But there are many of us, like the rooster, who think that we crow and then the sun comes up. That the sun rises and sets on us and our plans and on what we're doing, and that we are the center of the universe. Can I tell you, friends, that we are not the center of the universe? But also note the way that he responds, as we pointed out, to this tax collector. I'm not like this tax collector. He thought himself superior to everyone else. Bible commentator Kent Hughes noted that the previous parable reveals what our prayers think about God, and this parable reveals what our prayers think about ourselves. Note that he thanked God he was not like the extortioners, the adulterers, all the other people that were beneath him. In other words, no one was serving God like he was. No one was worshiping like he was. Nobody was as pious as he was. Nobody was as faithful as he was. Dear friends, if we're not careful, we can fall into that same mode. Look at me and how hard I'm working for the Lord. Look at all the effort that I put out. Look at me doing all the things that I'm doing, and brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so, they never show up to help. God help them. And in ways big and small, and in ways explicit and implicit, we think that we are superior to others because of what we do. I don't know about you, but I've caught myself on that own trap. I wish everybody would serve the Lord like me. How many's ever said that? You don't have to raise your hand. But you know it's true in your own heart. Boy, if everybody served the Lord like me, man, we would be tough, wouldn't we? We would be able to get something done for God's kingdom. It's the same attitude the Pharisee had. It's an attitude that is born of pride. It's an attitude of superiority, that no one can do it like we can do it, that no one can serve God like we can do it, that nobody's doing as well as we are, that nobody's as holy as we are, that nobody's killing sin like we are. Friends, this is the deception of religion. And the deception of religion is simply this, that we measure our Christianity by what we do rather than by what's been done for us. Let me say that again. We measure our Christianity by what we do rather than what's been done for us. Understand that every other religion in this world, no matter what it is in direct opposition to the message of Christianity. The core message of Christianity, no matter how much effort we put toward it, we will never be able to be accepted by God by what we do. All of our righteousness, the Bible tells us, is like filthy rags. It's a system that is doomed to fail. But yet so many of us continue to try to work the system, don't we? It hasn't worked so far, but I'm going to keep pumping it. And what happens if we're not careful, we can even preach this implicit or this subtle gospel of works that we must do this and must do this and you must do this and you must go here and you must not drink or chew or go with girls who do, and all these kinds of things. And we put people under such bondage and burdens that they could never shoulder. And that's why Jesus said, "Learn of me and see that I am meek and lowly in heart." I want to take your burdens, not add more burdens onto you. But here's another issue when we think that we are superior to others. If we think that we're superior to others, we'll never be able to serve them. If you think you're better than somebody else, you'll never be able to serve them because you're better than they are. They exist to serve you. They exist to serve your needs. And how often do we see this in churches all across the world? Not just in America. It's not endemic to America. It's endemic to the human problem, to our sin, that we think that we come into a church and that everybody should cater to us, to our preferences, to our idols, to our religious observances, to our ways, and understanding that when we come into a church, we leave ourselves on the outside because the only one who is worthy to be exalted in this house is Christ. The only one whose will we want to be done in this house is Christ. But all of us, and I'm not just pointing the finger at you, I'm saying this to myself as well. The Bible repeatedly warns us. Romans 12:3, think not more highly of yourselves than you ought. Philippians 2:3, prefer others above yourself. Galatians 5:13, serve one another in love. If you're going to kill the Pharisee in you, it starts with renouncing your pride. Secondly, it continues with recalibrating your attitude. Recalibrate your attitude. Note the posture of the tax collector. Verse 13. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Notice several things that are in order for us here in this passage about having the right attitude, recalibrating our attitude from one of pride toward one of humility. First of all, notice the way that Jesus addresses the tax collector in verse 13, in contrast to the way that he addresses a Pharisee. Note that he notes there was a Pharisee, meaning could have been one of many, but there was the tax collector. Why add the definite article, the, onto the front of tax collector? Because Jesus wanted to show us that the tax collector thought of himself in a class by himself. In other words, where the Pharisee also thought of himself as in a class by himself because he was so much holier than everyone else, the tax collector was saying, I am the one who is standing in the need of prayer. I'm in a class of sinner all by myself. Notice also that Jesus tells us that he stands afar off from the community while they're praying. Whereas at one end of the boundary between the holy place or the most holy place and the court of Israel, the Pharisee was lifting up his arms with his phylacteries hanging down and declaring how good he was. At the other end, on the boundaries of the court of Israel and the court of the Gentiles, was this tax collector who dare not go near the community of faith because he felt himself so unworthy. Jesus tells us that he wouldn't even look up. Having your eyes lifted heavenward was one of the postures that the Jews took. He utters a prayer, and it's just a simple little prayer. God, be merciful to me. Let's apply this. If we're going to have this attitude of humility Jesus is teaching us, then you must see yourself for who you are and see God